There's a moment in every country's history when it stops pretending, when the law no longer functions as a shield for the weak, but as a weapon against them, when dissent is rebranded as danger, when compassion is prosecuted as conspiracy. This episode is about that moment, told through the life and trials of one man who's dedicated himself to defending some of the most vulnerable communities in India's tribal heartland. This is the story of Kobad Ghandy. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. Sam is not with us today, but she'll be back in another episode. Here at Collectively Vigilant, we learn the law through true crime. So if that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to our channel on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We have a catalog of 34 episodes ready for you to binge. If you like this show, please consider sharing it and leaving us a review. It genuinely helps us out. Now let's start with the life of Kobad Ghandy. Kobad Ghandy was born in 1951 in Bombay, which is now known as Mumbai, into a wealthy Parsi family. Now, for listeners unfamiliar with Parsis, they're a very small ethno-religious community in India who follow the Zoroastrian religion, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, originating in ancient Persia, which is now modern-day Iran. Parsis arrived in India between 8th to 10th centuries AD after fleeing conquest and persecution in their own country. Over time, Parsis have been heavily concentrated in the Bombay/Mumbai region of India, and despite their small numbers, they've become very influential in India's educated circles. They're highly represented in law, science, philanthropy, not only during the British rule, but even after that. You will find that Parsis are brilliant lawyers, brilliant legal minds. They are CEOs, they're editors of newspapers in India. They're very good looking people, so they are heavily represented in Bollywood as well. So in short, being born a Parsi in mid-20th century Bombay often meant that you would live a life of an educated elite. You would have professional networks and insulation from the brutalities that the rest of India had to offer. Kobad Ghandy's father was a senior finance executive at Glaxo, which is a pharmaceutical giant, and the family lived really well. They were part of elite circles, they had financial security, and they had the kind of access that could buy them anything. Kobad followed this expected path. He attended the Doon School, which is often known as the Eton of India, the best school of India. He then attended St. Xavier's College, also the best college of India at that time, and then attended Cambridge University. He eventually started his career working as a chartered accountant. So when he went to the UK in the 1960s to train as a chartered accountant, which was a common route for many elite Indians of his generation, he formally began articling in an auditing firm known as Jackson and Pixley in the city of London. He studied there, he sat for exams, he worked while he was studying. He did articleship at Selfridges, which suggests that he wasn't living a life of a sheltered foreign student, but he basically had an ordinary professional life just like any other person would have had in the 1960s in London. But in the UK, Kobad encountered something that didn't fit the polished world that he had been prepared for. He was never prepared for the racism that came his way. And it didn't just offend him on a human level, it radicalized him. He began attending political meetings in working class areas and speaking publicly against racism, and he saw this racism as part of Britain's imperial hypocrisy. His activism escalated over time, and during a peaceful protest, he was arrested, beaten by the police, and then sentenced to prison for 3 months. But it's very important to remember that there was no allegation of violence against him. He was just prosecuted and put into jail because he was a peaceful protester. After his release from prison, he returned to his professional track and continued studying. He took a study leave and sat for all his exams, but ultimately he resigned from Jackson and Pixley with one final exam still pending. The firm really regretted Kobad's leaving, but Kobad did not. His path had truly changed. He no longer wanted to become a qualified chartered accountant, not because he had failed, but because he chose to walk away. He then returned to India. Back in Bombay, he didn't slide gently into an elite life. He joined political organizing, specifically the Progressive Youth Movement of India. That's where he met a young woman by the name of Anuradha Shanbag, and this woman later became his wife. Anuradha Shanbag, the woman who later became his wife, was unusual for the same reasons that Kobad was. She too was born into a highly educated, politically conscious, upper middle class family, and she deliberately rejected a life that her background had to offer. She was the daughter of Ganesh Shanbag, a prominent Bombay attorney who regularly defended the cause of the unprivileged of India. He even defended communists during the Telangana struggle. She was also the daughter of Kumud Shanbag, her mom, who was a prominent social activist. Anuradha was very academically accomplished. She had finished her bachelor's, master's, and then an MPhil in sociology and worked as a sociology professor. She had a respectable and stable profession by the time Kobad came into her life. Like Kobad, she did not just drift into a life of politics just as a whim. She walked away from a secure life with full awareness of what she was giving up. As they met in the mid to late 1970s through left-wing politics and civil liberties activism, neither Kobad nor Anuradha converted the other. They were already very committed to the cause that had brought them together. They got married in the year 1977, and even their marriage reflected something rare in radical politics. Not a rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a kind of moral consciousness and seriousness. Kobad reportedly asked her parents' consent with humility and respect, even though both he and Anuradha were stepping into a life that most families would panic about. They committed to a life that separates political theatre and virtue signaling from actual political commitment. They chose a life of poverty. After marriage, they didn't just perform simplicity, they lived it. They moved into precarious housing, eventually into the Dalit localities of Nagpur and later to Indore, where they lived in rented shanties with no possessions besides some books. Their income basically came from irregular lecturing and movement work here and there. They shunned the inheritance that their families had to offer. Many people describe their home as containing little more than 2 trunks of books, 2 pieces of clothing, and a single glass of water. Both of them commuted on a battered bicycle and later eventually acquired a moped. They were working for the Dalits of India. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, Dalits are communities that are historically treated as quote-unquote the untouchables of India. Under India's caste system, the Dalits were pushed outside the 4 traditional caste categories and forced into degrading work. They were forced to pick up excrement, be landless laborers who had to live a life of constant degradation that was no different from what the black community had faced in America. The Dalits have always been denied dignity, education, and safety. And this dignity runs deep. People do not sit with Dalits. People do not eat food with Dalits. People do not offer them water or even allow them to collect water from rivers where upper caste people usually get their water. Though discrimination is illegal on paper, but caste violence is rampant in India and their exclusion remains real in many parts of India. Dalits are roughly between 16 to 17% of India's population according to very conservative estimates. That makes it around 200 million people who live a constant life of indignity. Kobad Ghandy and Anuradha Shanbag didn't just advocate for these communities from afar. They moved into their neighborhoods, they built relationships with these people, and they organized for them. In the 1960s, though India was free from British rule, but Indians were still shackled by colonial era land laws that created a system that, as per the 1971 census, 60% of India's population in the 1960s and early 1970s were landless peasants. A lion's share of land was owned by only 4% of India's rich. It was in this context that a peasant uprising began in a small village in North Bengal called the Naxalbari village. This village became the epicenter of an armed struggle against the government and against landowners. This was the movement in which Kobad Ghandy and Anuradha Shanbag were activists in. Time and again, this movement was crushed by the state machinery within months, but this movement found a lot of sympathizers from around India, and it slowly moved towards the countryside, where it became a violent struggle that began roughly 65 years ago. The Naxal movement derives its name from that small village that I told you about in West Bengal. The movement is based on Mao Zedong's revolutionary ideas, which promoted armed conflicts as a means to overthrow the oppressive state system. These people wanted to establish what they called the people's government. Students from elite colleges also abandoned their respectable careers, just like Anuradha and Kobad, and joined the revolutionary cause. But not many people sustained that cause for their whole life. Politics was no longer something that students wanted to debate. In the 1970s, many became part of that struggle. Anuradha Shanbag became involved in the progressive youth movement, which was inspired by Naxalite politics. She had initially worked as a lecturer of sociology, so she was very familiar with the oppressive Indian caste system, which had kept the Dalits and the tribal people of India marginalized for centuries. Kobad and Anuradha worked alongside each other, organizing for the Committee for the Protection of Democratic Rights, documenting state violence, building networks amongst the Dalits and the tribals of India with the workers and students at colleges around India. By the early 1980s, Kobad and Anuradha had joined the Central Committee of CPI, which is basically the Communist Party of India. The movement was expanding far outside of Maharashtra. By the mid-1990s, Anuradha Shanbag and Kobad Ghandy further joined the Naxal leadership in the jungles of Bastar and were mostly living a life underground. Life in these areas was completely unforgiving and brutal. There was constant movement, there was constant malaria, hunger, heat, exhaustion, but they never gave up. Anuradha, through her course of living with the tribals of India, learned several tribal languages. She taught women in these areas not only to stand up for themselves and question the patriarchal structures, but also question the government. She helped draft the first serious caste policy papers within India's Naxal movement and India's Marxist movement. She wrote on Marxism and feminism. She built many cooperatives throughout India. She helped village reconstruction, and so did Kobad. When the government finally began to notice the movement and these two leaders, they panicked several times and offered these two money. This was an offer both Kobad and Anuradha refused. They worked continuously. They worked and worked through years of illness, years of malaria, sunstroke, serious diseases, and at the end, after almost 40 years of living in the rural regions of India, Anuradha Shanbag surfaced briefly in Mumbai in the year 2008. She was ill with severe fever. When she was finally taken to mainline hospitals, the blood test showed that she had 2 deadly strains of malaria. Since the government was keeping an eye on both Anuradha and Kobad, they had always resorted to never going to the hospitals or anywhere where they could be tracked and their work could be stopped. So by the time Anuradha came to the doctors, it was a little too late. Anuradha Gandhi, Kobad Gandhi's wife, and the social activists activist, died in April 2008. She was just 54 years old. After Anuradha died in the year 2008, in September 2009, Kobad Ghandy was booked under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA, and was accused of being a senior leader and eventually a Politburo member of the CPI Maoist party. These were headline charges used to justify his incarceration and repeated publicly and relentlessly by the government so they could justify his arrests. In court, however, these charges failed, but the slow grind of the Indian court system meant that Kobad Ghandy, who was jailed in September of 2009, was then kept in jail for the next 10 years as an undertrial. The bulk of this time was spent in Tihar jail in Delhi, followed by several transfers by the Indian government to different parts of India. He was then sent to the Hyderabad jail, the Patiala jail, the Vishakhapatnam jail, and the Jharkhand jails. From the very outset, he was placed as a high-risk person, and these are spaces designed in Indian jails for extreme control rather than any kind of rehabilitation. Entry into the Tihar jail involved repeated strip searches, forced recordings, removing all clothing, and sitting for hours without any layer of clothing. Complete and absolute humiliation. Procedures which have explicitly been identified as colonial and feudal hangovers of the Indian state. Inside these jails, surveillance on Kobad Ghandy was constant. There were CCTV cameras in operation 24/7. They were often positioned in near even the toilets. Lights were kept on 24/7, a practice that Kobad Ghandy later notes in his book aligns with internationally recognized forms of sleep deprivation. His movement was monitored. His medical access was almost none. He had to constantly write to request reading materials and books, and he had to constantly ask for permissions for legal consultation. Things that were arbitrarily denied without any rhyme or reason. Transfers between jails were so frequent and sudden and absolutely humiliating. These were done at an hour's notice, and this disrupted whatever little medical care and legal preparation that he was getting from the outside world. Now, one thing to note is when the Indian government picked up Kobad Ghandy in New Delhi, he was standing outside the Bikaji Kama market, and he had gone there to pick up some computer material. And at this point, he was already diagnosed and suffering from cancer. So he had come to Delhi basically to get some treatment for his cancer, and that's when he was picked up and put into jail for 10 years. Although this whole time he was legally under trial, Kobad Ghandy describes in his book being treated as if he was already convicted. His lawyers could only visit him once a week. His phone access was completely inconsistent and revoked time and again without any explanation. Books and newspapers were given to him sometimes but not other times, and punishment was normal. Restrictions were placed on him at all times. In his book, he also documents how prison regulations were selectively enforced on some prisoners and not on others. Medical negligence towards Kobad Ghandy was systematic. Despite documented spinal problems, arthritis, and cancer diagnosis, his access to hospitals remained scant. He records instances in his book where prisoners who had life-threatening conditions were never treated and hence died in custody. In his book, he also time and again recounts that all prison cells, no matter where he was taken in India, were overcrowded by inmates who were under trial, who had never seen their day in court. Inmates had been housed and packed like sardines in a can. Kobad Ghandy shared spaces with people who were criminal under trials, people who were on death row, political detainees, and the violence towards all the prisoners, including Kobad Ghandy, was both overt, covert, and structural. These 10 years were perhaps institutional indignity which was levied upon him, but he does recount some moments of humanity where he had moments of solidarity with fellow prisoners, where they would share food, conversations, informal teaching, intellectual exchanges with fellow prisoners, some of whom had been in jail despite never doing anything at all. To preserve his sanity, Kobad Ghandy read extensively. He wrote extensively. He practiced yoga every day and maintained some sort of sanity through his mental discipline. Though, time and again, the prison system killed people, designed to extinguish hope. Kobad Ghandy was kept in jail for 10 years by the state machinery. He was moved from one prison to the other throughout India. But when he was actually presented to different courts around India, the judges could see through those charges. Most of the evidence was exceptionally insufficient, and he was eventually released from prison in 2019, a few days before the COVID pandemic hit the entire world and especially India. Through the pandemic, he sat down and wrote his memoir called Fractured Freedom, which I will link in the description box. I urge you to buy the book if you're interested in the life that Anuradha and Kobad have led and the activism that Kobad still continues to be a part of. In no way is this episode doing any justice to the struggle of Kobad Ghandy and Anuradha Shanbag and the millions of unsung heroes who continue to fight against state machinery and corruption around India, but it's a little effort in enlightening people who probably don't know anything about this. So I urge you to buy that book and see if you like it and you want to understand more about the struggle of the poor against, and especially the Dalits of India, against the rich of India. So I'm going to stop here today, and until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.